Okay, we're going to get started this morning. Welcome everyone to our Geriatrics Grand Rounds. I have a couple of announcements before we get started. Our next Grand Rounds will be on the 19th of October. The speaker is Dr. Liz Goldberg, and the topic is the Gap Care Study. Our next journal club is going to be the 12th. Next week, it'll be a virtual session on Zoom. The presenters will be Dr. Samantha Farrow and Dr. Jeff Wallace, topics of their choice, articles of their choice. Other announcements, Geriatrics, the Geriatrics Division meeting will follow today's presentation by Dr. Earnest. And then following today's Grand Rounds, you will receive a link in an email to the recording of today's presentation, as well as an online evaluation. Please take the time to complete that. It's very, very helpful for us and our speakers. And please submit any questions in the chat or Q&A boxes during the presentation today for those who are online virtually. I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Earnest. He is a tenured professor of medicine here at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus and the division head of general internal medicine. He grew up in the Appalachian foothills in Kingsport, Tennessee, in a family and culture of storytellers. He earned his bachelor's degree at Wake Forest, his medical degree from Vanderbilt, and a PhD in health and behavioral sciences from the University of Colorado. He came to Colorado for his residency and, having never found a compelling reason to leave, is still here. He is an avid lifelong reader, photographer, telemark skier, dog walker, Kiwi and Snoopy are his dogs, and full-service husband and father of two. Children are Elliot, age 22, and Olivia, age 20. He would love to write novels for a living when he grows up. Welcome, and thank you so much, Dr. Mark Earnest.
Well, thanks. It's really an honor to be here. I feel kind of like it's one of those extended family reunions with members of the family that you don't see or in some cases haven't met yet. But, you know, as a general internist, I've always felt really close with geriatrics and have worked with our geriatrics colleagues over the years. And so when Devin asked me to come give a talk on narrative medicine, we didn't really talk about what you had in mind. I just took great liberties with it. So as some of you all may know, I got to spend about a year ago, moved to Italy for 5 months. So these are just some pictures of some of the stories that I got to enter in while I was there. I'll start with some disclosures. As Devin mentioned, I have two dogs that I sometimes feed from the table, and it is not a pleasing thing for my wife. I take great honor in my poorly received dad jokes, and as he mentioned, I've had a lifelong fantasy of being a novelist, and I am currently not a novelist. But along with that is insecurity about my own writing, and I hope maybe we can talk a little bit about that here. That has made me a student of writing. So any opportunity I get to go sit at a workshop or sit at the foot of somebody who writes and learn, I've taken those opportunities. I really love patient care. It's the sort of sacred space in my week. And Devin and I were just talking. I don't do as much of it as I used to, but those hours are really important to me, and that space in the exam room with a patient feels really sacred. Part of that is the affinity I feel towards patient stories, and I should say I'm not an expert on narrative medicine. So there is a field of narrative medicine. How many of y'all are familiar with that? That's a term you've heard. And so, I mean, you literally can get a master's degree in narrative medicine. I do not have one. So you're talking with somebody who is, let's just say, an aficionado of the concepts and who's tried to practice what I think is described as narrative medicine over the course of a lifetime. I bring up patient care and writing because I see them as very intertwined. And I think the things that draw me to one are the things that draw me to the other. I have no financial conflicts. So let me say a little more about that affinity for stories. This is just a schematic that I put together of ways in which I think we understand our world. And so if you start on the left-hand side, an atom and the whole space of subatomic particles, and I have a great admiration for a mind that can look at this and say, gee, I wonder if there are particles within a neutron that form this, or the things even smaller than this. And then as we collect atoms into molecules, and as those molecules assemble into more complex molecules and cells, and as those assemble into organs, and as those organs become bodies, and then we collect those bodies and we randomize them and we expose them to drugs, and then at the far end, there's the sense making that we do all out of that. We do the stories we tell, the meanings that we make out of that. And having a sort of broad scientific liberal arts education, I have enjoyed learning about all of that. I've admired the minds that can pick apart an atom, but I quickly realized that mine was not one of those. So the things that wake me up at night, the questions that have always compelled me, the things that occupy my mind when it's quiet, have always been kind of at the right end of that. And I'm wondering how many of you is that describe you? And so I think it's something we share as humans. I think everybody spends time in that space. I realized early on, as I was drawn towards academics, that I was not going to be somebody who was going to discover a new disease mechanism, that's just not what my mind was built to do. But that the thing that I was going to pursue the things most that really compelled me, and that I felt strongly about, the questions that I felt compelled to answer, and they tended to be at the far end of that, which I think is what drew me to the concepts around narrative medicine. So these are I've got a very short agenda. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some select insights from the field of narrative medicine. I want to spend a little time with all of you, sort of thinking of the stories in your own lives and probing those, looking for what underlies them. If we have time, for those of you who are interested in writing, I have a little exercise and a few tips that have been really helpful for me in improving my own writing. So if we have time to get to that. And then just a warning, I have some gratuitous displays of photos from our time in Italy last winter. And this picture, how many of you all been to Florence? So a few hands. I recommend it. That's where we got to spend the winter last year. This is the Arno, which is the river that runs through Florence. It's the reason Florence is where it is the Arno River, which eventually winds through Pisa and reaches the sea. So in the Renaissance, you could sail a ship all the way up to the bridge you see, and there actually were docks there. The apartment that we lived in was about a block and a half from here. So this was the morning scene when you walked out on the bridge. So this is taken from a bridge looking up the river, and kind of past the bridge you can see in the foreground is the Ponte Vecchio, which is the oldest bridge and the only one of the bridges to survive World War II that was not dynamited by the Nazis at the end of the war. So the field of narrative medicine, you can see the date of this reference is 2001. This is really the sort of sentinel article by a woman named Rita Sharon. How many of you all have heard of Rita or know of Rita? So just a couple of hands. So Rita is at Columbia, and she, I think, could be said to be the founder or the mother of narrative medicine. But the quote you see there is actually to describe narrative competence. So it's the ability to acknowledge, absorb, interpret, and act on the stories and plights of others. So we have, I should say I'm going to use we and include Rita in that, have accommodated this under this label of narrative medicine. But I would say this is actually a competence that extends beyond medicine. I mean, you could say there's narrative marriage, there's narrative parenting, there's narrative friendship. But that this is this competence, this ability to acknowledge, hear a story, reflected back in a way that the teller appreciates that you've heard it and you've acknowledged it, absorb it, to be influenced by it, to take it in and be changed perhaps by it, to interpret it, so perhaps offer new insights into that story, and then to act on it. That those are very human things, and that those are competencies, I think, that enrich our lives, that improve our relationships, and make us more effective as human beings. The picture you see there is, there's a cemetery that sits, that looks down on the city of Florence, and in the lower left, that figure, this is the statue on his tomb, his grave. He was a physician who died, and this is all I could just discern from sitting in front of the tomb, died between the wars at the age of 32. And this is the memorial his family chose to put together to him. And I bring that up just to note that there are many ways we can enter stories. This is a couple of other pictures from the same funeral, or I'm sorry, the same cemetery. And I'll draw your attention to the one on the right. So you can see from the tombstone that this is Bruna Minucci. You can't see the date of her birth, but because it's April 28th, 1916. The date of her death that's July 21st, 1920. So she was 4 years old and just a few months. And you can tell from the front of the tombstone at the lower part that she went by BB. And then look at the statue itself. So what do you all see in the face of that little girl? Does anybody want to conjecture what sort of little girl BB was? What's that? Curious? Looking up? What's that? Mischievous? Yeah, that's part of what I saw, Sarah. As when I saw this, I was sort of picturing this was the moment after she took the last cookie out of the cookie jar without permission. But the thing you see so BB died 102 years before this picture was taken, and what you see at her foot, the little orange thing there. So in Italy, on Epiphany, so about 10 days after Christmas, they have a holiday they call La Befana, and La Befana is a character, it's a witch, and it's La Befana who brings gifts to the child rather than Santa Claus in Italy. So this picture was taken probably 6 weeks after La Befana. But one of the things that was striking to me walking through the cemetery is 102 years after this 4-year-old died, somebody came and left a La Befana gift. And this is sort of the sort of iconic gift. They wrap up with some straw candy, and it's one of the, you'll see these, it's sort of the iconic image of La Befana is this. And so I have no idea who, but this child who died over 100 years ago, his story is still engaged with the present in that way, which was, interesting to note. Similarly, you would find many of these statuary memorials were still tended by the families. And so there would be flowers and other things left at the graves, often for people who had died many years before. Does anybody know this book? Is it familiar? So this was a book that was assigned to me by an anthropology professor when I was doing some graduate work. And Cheryl Mattingly, who wrote it, as an occupational therapist who worked in a spinal cord injury ward. So all of the people she worked with had something very traumatic happen that had disrupted their lives. And she starts really with this point that disability and illness disrupt the plot of our lives. And she made the point, which was really made a great impression on me, is that every life has a plot. We are all protagonists in the plots of our own lives, as are our patients, as are the people we're around. And often that plot is so deeply ingrained that we have a hard time even articulating it, right? That we have an understanding, and it is who we are, this plot, who we are to ourselves, who we are to the world, the type of people we are, who we are in relation to others. And that illness and injury, trauma, disability, all those things disrupt that plot. We're on this plot that's predictable, this narrative, and suddenly we're not. That changes, and that really these dramas and clinical plots are the things in medicine that we engage with, and the things that we need to intervene with. And she makes the point that one task of a healer is to help people work on developing a new plot. So we have a lovely family that lives next door to us, and the parents are about 10 years younger than us, and their kids are school aged. And they taught me a sort of fun lesson in this. They have a family sort of shared meme that they refer to as the plot twist. So whenever anything goes wrong or without is unexpected, one of them who recognizes this will turn to the other and go, plot twist. And so it's been really fun to watch this little 6-year-old pixie who's like trips and falls and scrapes her knee and hops up and goes, plot twist. But it's been instructive for me. I think it's a great way to sort of approach life, to approach failure. I think one of our challenges as human beings, as practitioners, is to help patients understand what happens to them as a plot twist, and to help them think about, and this is what Mattingly refers to as re-emplotment. So how do we help them work through the details of their story in a way that a story of loss and victimhood becomes a story of heroism, of resilience, of overcoming. And if anybody wants to read this book, I have a copy on my shelf in my office. So how do we do that? Most of the things I'm going to put on this slide are things that you all already know. It starts with listening, and that's core to being effective at this. And most of this is about how we listen well. So we ask open-ended questions. We reflect. We think about those open-ended questions and the answers. What do they mean? What do they mean to the patient? What are we being told? We do that without judgment. We paraphrase and repeat back what we've heard and check for validity. We mirror, we use the patient's words and say them back to them. We maintain our curiosity. We keep asking questions. We probe further, and then we help them seek alternatives. Does this resonate? Does this sound like what you do in your practice and your lives? Okay. Has anybody heard this term before? Nobody? Okay. So this is a term that comes from anthropology. A guy named Geriatric framed this concept back in the 80s. But it is, he describes it as the task of ethnography, is thick description. This is I found it useful as a way of thinking about how we understand narratives and how we look for meanings. So I want you to look at this picture and tell me what you think's going on. What do you see?
It's winking at Joe Biden.
Okay. Any other interpretation? So winking at Joe Biden. Giving approval. Any others? What's that? Maybe he has palsy. Okay, thank you for that. So think about you looked at this, and 2 out of 3 people offered an explanation that was that inferred a lot, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that go into deciding it's a wink or who he's winking at, and yet there's a sort of scientific explanation perhaps for what's going on. So could it be a palsy? Could it be a muscular twitch? We could just describe this could be the picture in the textbook of blepharospasm, right? He got something in his eye, and yet think about everything that goes into a wink, what's entailed in that. And so actually a wink is an example Geertz used in his original description of thick description, and saying that there's a very sort of superficial layer in which we can understand something. It's sort of the things on the left side of that arc I showed you, the physical phenomenon, the physiology, and we can stop there. But the things that make us understand or interpret this as a wink are layered, they're nuanced, they're complex, and you all could make some really detailed narratives at a glance without seeing the room, without seeing what's going on, without seeing the sequence of this, and that is thick description. So the thick description is being able to peel apart the layers, understand the meaning, extract them from the person who you're engaged with, the patient, the family member, whoever it is, and being able to construct the narrative. And then with ethnography, the goal is to be able to do that in a way where you can turn it back around to the person that you're listening to and have them look at it and say, that's exactly right. That is me. That's the story I'm involved with. You heard me. That's exactly right. So I want to sort of plant that concept in your heads, because that's been one that, like I said, this was a concept introduced to me years ago, but it's one that I sort of revisit all the time. Am I able to describe this thickly? Am I able to sort of peel apart those layers? So Sharon said that they're really in 4 central narratives in medicine. The one we probably think about the most is physician and patient. So the story of our relationship with the patient, our engagement with them. We enter into their stories as what an anthropologist would call a participant observer. So we are observing, we're drawing from their story, but because we are participating, we are also in some ways changing their story. Just the fact that we're there and that we listen and reflect and respond changes the story without any sort of act other than those things: listening, reflecting, absorbing. But we also, in some ways, are co-authoring their stories if we do that work that Mattingly describes and of helping them re-implot their stories. There are narrative stories of physician and self. So how do those stories affect us? How do we grow? How do we become better people and develop? They're stories of us and our colleagues, and they're stories of physicians and society. So as I said, I'm not an expert on narrative medicines, but I took the invitation as an opportunity to kind of go back and review some of the literature. And a lot of the things that are there were sort of on that slide: listening, open-ended questions. But there were a few that sort of stood out to me that I thought were interesting and worth sharing. One, how many of you all are comfortable with silence? So I have to say, I'm one of those people that races to fill a silence up. I interpret it as discomfort, and it has been useful for me. Actually, was originally sort of challenged to do this by in a course that I went to about teaching, and the instructor there sort of observed this about me, and he said, you need to just shut up, and let things happen. And that was really, really good advice. And so, and I think this is true with patients, is a lot of meaningful things happen in silence. And so I just bring that up because I think that's important. The second is we do have tasks to attend to. You know, as an ethnographer would spend the entire time they have with somebody simply with the story. And there's a point where we have to start attending to the disease and you know, to the twitch, the spasm, as opposed to the wink. But this is just a reminder to say that if we have to interrupt it, the narrative goes on, and we should think about returning to it. So when do we return to it and make sure that we maintain that thread? The third, and I really love this one, I have to remind myself of this, is we think about difficult patients, right? They're the people that don't do what seems obvious to them, to us, that they should do. And to note that every single, to that patient, what they do makes perfect sense in the narrative plot of their life, right? There is a story behind that explains exactly why they do it, why they don't take their medication, why they miss their appointment, all those things. And if we listen and engage in that narrative, we can understand that. And if we want to change that behavior to something else, we need to understand that. So to understand that as a block narrative and not the product of a flawed or difficult patient. The second or the fourth is to try not to race towards solutions and management of the problems, but to be open to the narrative understanding. And then the last is the question that I think I often forget, which is sort of the why now? Why is this person coming with this complaint now? When I switched from being a resident to being attending, I literally at the time walked down the hall and went into another set of exam rooms. And about 3 weeks into that, I had a patient that was on my schedule I'd never met before, totally new patient. And this was back in the era of paper charts. But we had, these shelves and shelves and shelves of paper charts that were often dog-eared. And so this person had been on the faculty for 30 some years, was a basic scientist, just retired, in his 70s. And they bring to me his chart. And it is literally the thinnest chart I've ever seen, other than a completely new patient. I mean, it was yellowed from the fact that it had been there for 30 some years. It had like 3 pieces of paper in it. It had a problem list that was empty on the side. And this man came into me on this particular day and just didn't feel right. I mean, so in 35 years, he'd never come in and talk to anybody about not feeling right. And so as I sort of peeled it apart, his symptoms were vague. He had this kind of vague sense of doom, maybe a little bit of breathlessness. And so I went through sort of the usual thing. I did an EKG, and there were some changes that were really subtle. So here I am. I've just spent 3 years as a resident. I'm contemplating admitting this man to my colleagues. And one of our favorite narratives was the weak admission, right? It's like somebody calls up an admission and it's like, oh my God, can you believe that they admitted this guy? And here I am trying to decide whether to do that or not. And I did. I called a friend of mine who was on the floor, and I called up a chest pain rule out. Well, this guy ruled in. And really, when I think about it, the only reason that, I mean, if his chart had been thicker, and he had come in for a lot of complaints, I probably would have sent him home. But the one sort of thing in all that was this question of why now? There was a portion of this man's story, his life plot, that was apparent just from how thin his chart was, and that was the clue that made all the difference. So Sharon, I wrote a book. You can see about 5 years after her Sentinel article, you can see in the reference there in 2006. About narrative medicine. And one of the things she talks about are the divides we encounter, the distance between where we enter narratives and where patients are, that I find useful. And one is this, our relationship to mortality. So think about that man I just described to you, the senior professor coming in because things just didn't feel right. For me, I already told you the element. It's like I'm 3 weeks into my career as an attending. I'm anxious about whether I admit a patient that doesn't deserve to be admitted, and the culture of the hospital. That's the space I'm in. I'm mortality is not big on my list. This man's coming in because he's afraid. He's afraid something that he's having an encounter with his own mortality, and there's a distance there that I think is present almost all the time in our clinics. That people come to us because they're worried about their relationship with their own mortality, and we are having very normal days with our own sets of needs and distractions. The second is the context of illness. So again, they're entering our world where we're quite comfortable. They go home to a world where they're in relationship with families. Their roles and their identities are threatened. And we aren't often taking the time to sort of appreciate that context. And yet that's where they're suffering. That's where the meaning of the illness and its impact on them becomes apparent. Beliefs about disease causality. This is certainly not news to anybody here, right? Our patients come in with their own stories of why they got sick, what happened to them, and it often is very different from our own understanding of it. And so thinking about how we enter that, how we bridge that, how we help bring them into some understanding of causality that will enable that narrative to include the therapies that we feel are important for them. And then finally, shame, blame, and fear, which are often parts of illness and suffering, and ones that if we don't take time to think about, we may miss and not appreciate. This is slide. Okay, so I want to talk now a little bit about that. So we talked about plots, and talk about how we do the work of discerning the plot. How do we start to sort of peel beneath the layers? And then I wanted to, does anybody heard the name Michael Lacombe? Does that ring a bell to anybody? So Mike Lacombe, I actually looked him up just to see, he is a physician, and for a number of years he wrote regularly in Annals of Internal Medicine. So he was sort of a kind of a regular contributor, and he wrote these really amazing stories that were largely the physician and patient narrative. And then he became the editor of On Being a Doctor for Annals for a number of years. And I looked up, he's actually still alive. He now has an appointment in creative writing at, I want to say the University of Maine. It's somewhere in Maine. But years ago, I told you, if there's a writing workshop and I'm there, I have the opportunity, I will go. And I went to a writing workshop that Michael Lacombe did. And at the time when he was editor of On Being a Doctor, he said, 98% of the stories that people send me and come to me have this plot. I had a patient, I liked them a lot, they got sick and died, and I was sad. And he said, in some ways I struggle with this because I know that this is underneath the plots that move us, right? This is the Cliff Notes version of the things that we take home with us at the end of the day. And he said, but I can't publish this, right? And there's this old adage in writing, and you guys may have heard this, but don't tell me, show me. Has anybody ever heard that before? So good writing doesn't interpret for the reader. It gives them the information they need to experience it and then interpret it themselves. So this is where I want to do a little bit of an exercise here. And I'd like everybody to have a piece of paper and something to write with. And while the paper's being handed out, I want you to think about somebody in your life that moved you. So whether that was a patient, whether that was a family member, but think about that narrative arc, a sense of loss or grief that you had related to somebody. And I want you to start with just thinking, and it doesn't have to be a patient, because as I said, this is about narrative living. It's narrative marriage, narrative friendship, that sort of thing. But think about that person, and I want you to take a few minutes and think about what makes them memorable. And think about their appearance, their habits, their beliefs, their values, and don't over edit it. Just find that person and think about those things. And I want you to jot a few of those things down. And I'm gonna just watch my watch, and I'm gonna give you about 3 minutes to do that. Okay, I'm going to shift your focus to the next element. I like them a lot. And I want you to think about why. What was it about that person that you had? What made that affinity? What was your connection to them? How did they make you feel? And what was it they did? Why did you feel that way about them? What did they do that created that connection? Okay, and I'm going to move us to the next one. So if this were a screenwriting course, this is the climax of the story, right? That something happened to that person. They got sick, they died, they suffered. And this would happen about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the movie plot or the play. But so I want you to think about that. What happened to them? How did they suffer? How did they triumph? How did whatever happened to them, whether it's an illness or something else, interact with who they are, with your relationship with them? Think about that and write down those elements. Okay, and I'm going to move us to the last part. The and this is part of the personal sense making of it. So why is this story the one you came up with? Why this person? Why this relationship? What did you lose? What did others lose? What did this experience teach you? What did you learn from it? I want you to think about that and jot down some thoughts there. So we're kind of a little short on time. So is there anybody who would be willing to share their story? Oh, come on. Surely there's somebody who's willing to at least give the outline to their story. And you don't have to, I mean, just what are the high points of having gone through that exercise? If there are no volunteers, I'm going to call on Devin. I'll go. Okay, let me give you a mic so people on that.
So this is more, they're not really complete sentences, but they're more thoughts about things. I'm just going to read what I wrote. Frail, lying on her side, warm eyes, sweeping arms welcoming into the room, rhythmic tucking of her knees to her chest, searching the members of the team, seeking comfort, curious and open, but fearful of pain, sharing kindness. There was a trust built over many visits, a warmth of knowing her values were our priority. This helped us feel confident in communicating openly about her mortality, that she was near the end of her life. She wasn't afraid, so we didn't have to be either. She lost her ability to walk and function as her vertebrae wilted under the burden of cancer. Moving became painful. She sought relief and healing. The neurosurgery team offered decompression and fusion with the hope for walking again, while she flirted with her deathbed. She paused, asking where she was. We talked. She understood. Hope was redirected, a desire to be home. Losing a rare strength, approaching the flames differently, one that doesn't wrestle mindlessly but dances with the flame.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Devin. Does anybody else want to? Well, first off, I said, don't tell me, show me. How many felt like you could see that scene? You could see that patient. You could understand the feelings that Devin and the team felt. I see nodding heads. I'm assuming that's agreement. So that, you know, that and I thought that was beautiful. I mean, that was the that's a thick description. That's a scene with nuance, with meaning. You can see it, you can play it out. You know, for me, that's the goal I try to set for myself, is to try to sort of peel those things apart. And it's also, I think, the thing I've always found magical about books and about writing and about communicating is the fact that, you know, you said those words, you wrote them, you thought about them, you said those words, and I experienced what you experienced, which has always just felt really, really magical to me. We're short on time, right? Do we need to wrap up about now? Okay. I'm going to take a minute and a half to do just a really quick thing, which is sort of, these are so three very simple things that if you like to write or want to write, that I think will make your writing stronger. And I'm going to ask you just to take 15 seconds to read this sentence. And if we had more time, I would ask you to think about what you like about it, what's good about the sentence, and what about it doesn't, it makes you struggle to get through it. And then I want, these are the sort of three top line points that that from reading other people's writing and from going through this. So this was a rule given to me by a writing teacher years ago that I found incredibly useful, which is to go through your writing, look for prepositions, figure out how to get rid of them. And she described prepositions as speed bumps in the writing. That if you read those last two sentences, dragonflies at intern were too busy to see the glorious dawn that was unfolding in the clouds, in the sky above them, you get that sense of how much it sort of attenuates the flow of a sentence, the flow of the ideas. So read your writing, look for prepositions. If you can identify them, the ways of getting rid of them will be obvious. So my kids had a writing teacher in 5th grade, and they had a funeral for dead verbs. So they all wrote, they made a tombstone, and they wrote is and was and are, and they went out in the playground and they planted those and created a cemetery of dead verbs. So Mrs. Dodge has planted that in my mind. So I go through my writing and I look for every place where I use a to be verb. I underline it and decide, is this really the verb I want there or not? Can I replace it with one that has more action and movement? If I do, I can. So caution. So the second, I inserted this I was odd to see in the sentence. And I bring this up because often when people ask me to edit their writing, they use a lot of self-reference. I thought, I felt, I believe. It's important to figure out what narrative you're writing. If the story is about your growth, it's about your plot, it's your movement, then first person references, self-reference, totally appropriate. If you're trying to convince somebody of something, if you're arguing, that only distracts them because it becomes a question of why should I believe you? And if you're writing a declarative, you should do this, we should do this, you should believe this, then just write what you believe, write what the opinion you want, and leave your self-reference out of it. And that is the end. So thank you all for your time and attention and for indulging me this morning. It's been my honor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Earnest. Looks like we have one comment. Oh, the iPhone is Kelly Heinrichs. Okay. Does anybody have any questions, thoughts for Dr. Earnest on this wonderful presentation? Questions, concerns?
We do a narrative project, and the students will like get stories from older adults and then rewrite it. But do you have any recommendations for how to do it, to pull out kind of details, or how to help the students to the writing or make it more where they you can see it versus kind of retell?
Yeah, so the question is about a narrative project where you ask students to retell a patient's story. Any tips for how to do that? Yeah, I don't. You know, for me, this is sort of has always been an iterative process, and so I find it's useful to I took Mike Lacomb's sort of thing and said, you know, that's actually the plot that I walk home with most days. Like what are so I think I would look for questions to you know, prompts for students to get them to look a little bit deeper. You know, some things that they can take into the exercise on a friend without a lot of thought. I'm not quite sure what those are, but it sounds like a wonderful exercise, because to me it's actually doing that and then reflecting back on it and then doing it again. That I think is how we develop into competent practitioners of narrative in our lives. Yeah, I'm sorry, that may not be very useful, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so what a great question. Yeah, so for those on the chat, so the question was really like how has narrative medicine changed through the pandemic, and so I think about those layers, physician and patient, physician and self, physician and physician, physician and society. I think you could draw a through line through all of that, and to me, the sort of backstory is we've developed this polarization, and we have to sort of choose sides and where we live and how we think of our lives, and our own narratives and identities and plots have sort of been cleaved in this way, and then the pandemic comes along, and there's probably 2 or 3 months where there's a bit of solidarity. We're all kind of looking at the same thing, and then it all starts to polarize. And so I think for me, the sort of narratives we play out in medicine, causation and things like that. And how many of you all got to see the grand rounds yesterday? So he was talking about communication and pandemic, and he showed this data that showed just some really, I'm trying to remember what the example was, but it was something that to me was really unexpected, that perfectly cleaved into terms of whether people identified as Republican or Democrat. And I wish I could remember but I mean, you all know exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, you walk in to have a conversation about health, and there's this layer in which that narrative is interpreted, and so I think we're in a one of the sort of theorists around professions is the fact that we're moderators in an open society, that we're and this particular person said, we're moderators in terms of sort of justice and power centers. So there's the government, and there's commerce, and the idea of a profession is to sit sort of dispassionately in the middle and moderate that. But I think we have a role in this to take people who have found opposition. People still have a relationship to their mortality. They still want to live long lives. They want to be healthy, and we're still mostly viewed as neutral parties. So if we listen, if we pull out those narratives, I think we have the opportunity to help people, to sort of re-plot that a bit and hopefully bring them back in the fold. Maybe get a vaccine now and then, that kind of thing.
There's a couple of things from the chat. Jeff Wallace said that this was wonderful. Is it part of our med student and or medical resident training? It should be.
Yeah, so there is, well, it sounds like there's some of the exercise you described, was that in so elective, yeah. So I don't know if you all know Mark Kissler, who's so Mark's in our hospital medicine group. Mark is actually a better person to give this talk than I am. I mean, he's got all this background and training on it. But there are parts of this. I'm not sure, Jeff, what's required or what's not. Tess Jones, who recently retired, she had a narrative medicine elective that she ran every year. That was, there were always 30 to 50 students who took it.
And from Abby online, in my research, I'm finding that story serves as a point of connection over a common shared experience. In the context of illness, these experiences often create shame and guilt, and thus loneliness, which, as you know, can create more problems. To the point about pandemic, shared connected folks over a shared experience during a time of extreme isolation.
I think that's incredibly well said. Yeah.
All right, we're all out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Earnest. Really appreciate you coming.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.